Lastly, let's bring the rest of the world to make our hypothetical economy close to the real world. The rest of the world is the last economic entity that is required to bring into our hypothetical world to make this as close to a real world as possible. Domestic firms buy imports from the rest of the world in exchange for money and sell exports in exchange for money to the rest of the world. Exports minus imports is called net exports. Now, when we look at outflows from firms, we see that firms pay incomes to households plus they pay for imports. Therefore, the total outflows from firms now becomes incomes plus imports. With exports introduced in our new economy, expenditures now becomes consumer expenditure, consumption expenditure, plus government expenditure, plus incomes, plus exports. But since we know that income equals expenditure equals products in our economy, we see that the left-hand side of the equation, which is income plus imports, equals C plus G plus I plus EX. Or therefore, incomes equals C plus G plus I plus EX minus IM. The right-hand side of this equation, C plus G plus I plus EX minus IM, where EX minus IM is net exports, is now the total expenditure in our economy. This aggregate expenditure is what we know as the gross domestic product and is a measure of the aggregate economic activity for that year. If the goods and services are measured in current year's prices, then it's called the nominal gross domestic product. But if they are adjusted for inflation, then it's called the real GDP, because goods and services are valued at a base year's price. We will discuss real versus nominal gross domestic product later in the inflation chapter. To summarize, we have seen that in our hypothetical world, income equals products equals expenditure, and therefore, in the real world, the gross domestic product is also measured by either of the three methods. In the expenditure approach, the gross domestic product is measured by aggregating consumer expenditure, the C in the equation, investment spending, the I in the equation, government spending, the G in the equation, and net exports, the EX minus IM. In the income approach, statisticians add the incomes generated from the factors of production, salaries, interest, rent, and profits. Since profits are the net of depreciation, and by definition, we have seen that gross domestic product doesn't account for depreciation. Depreciation is added back to the total figure. Lastly, in the products approach, the aggregate is computed by measuring the value of output of each industry and then aggregating. We now understand how GDP is computed, and by modeling the real world with our hypothetical world, we understand its components: consumer spending, government spending, investments, exports, and imports. This is the foundation of our economic map, to which we will keep referring to in order for us to make the connections between the economic indicator releases, the economic entities, the GDP components, and the financial markets. Before we begin with the economic indicators, we first need to understand the historical context of the gross domestic product figure to understand what high growth, sustainable growth, and recession is. We need to know the historical context of growth, inflation, and interest rates, because when any economic data is released, we can look back to see how the central bank had reacted in the past when confronted with similar data. So if sustainable growth had been, say, 3% historically, and if the current data indicates that the growth is far ahead of 3%, let's say more towards 4.5%, then we can look back and see how the central bank reacted in the past by either raising interest rates or by any other direct intervention in the foreign exchange markets. By looking back in the past, we can gauge whether they raise interest rates gradually or was it an aggressive intervention. We can also see what other economic factors were during periods of high growth or low growth. So, in order to make predictions on the future of economic growth, inflation, and interest rates, we need to have this historic context for our country of interest.